said, but he addressed the denial to the sheriff, not to the mayor. Harold came stalking across the room. When Thatcher saw what he was bringing with him, his stomach sank. It was a set of postcards that he had brought home from France. Harold had removed the string that bound them. Smirking at Thatcher, he passed the cards to Sheriff Amos.
"Found these in the bottom of his bag."
Each of the cards featured a photograph of a half-naked woman in a provocative pose. The sheriff fanned through them without comment or reaction, then formed a neat stack of them and set it face down on the nearby desk. Thatcher didn't offer any apology or explanation for them. Was there a man in the room who wouldn't enjoy taking a peek? The sheriff leaned back in his chair and tugged at the corner of his mustache while he studied Thatcher. Thatcher wished he knew what was going through the lawman's mind. Apparently, so did the mayor. Above the loud ticking of the wall clock's brass pendulum, he prompted him.
"Bill?"
Seeming to be in no hurry to respond, the sheriff waited another 15 seconds, then indicated the torn shoulder seam on Thatcher's coat.
"How'd that happen?"
"One of the men on the train made a grab for me."
"You really believe he jumped off a freight train, Bill?"
That from the mayor, whom the sheriff again ignored. He said,
"You could have broken your fool neck. Why didn't you stay on the train and fight it out?"
Thatcher glanced around. All of them were poised, waiting for an answer. He addressed the sheriff.
"I did."
"Did what?"
"Fought it out."
3 against 1?
"Wasn't my choice."
The sheriff reached for his hand and turned it palm up.
"How'd you get that cut?"
"One of the men came at me with a knife. I was defending myself."
"Against Mrs. Driscoll?"
the mayor said. The sheriff didn't acknowledge the remark.
"Back there in your room, you came at us like a vandal. I told you. I woke up with a shotgun to my head. I reacted."
"Violently," the mayor said.
The sheriff kept his attention on Thatcher.
3 against 1, 5 against 1. Where'd you learn to fight like that? A bunkhouse?
"He's obviously a dangerous individual, Bill."
"I'm not a danger to a woman,"
Thatcher fired back at the mayor.
"Sure as hell not one in the family way."
The doctor choked back a sob and held his fist against his mouth to contain others. Thatcher looked directly at the sheriff.
"Look, hopping the freight? Guilty. I was just trying to get home, and the Army didn't pay me enough to get there. I wasn't looking to fight the men on the train, but they would have killed me if I hadn't fought back. Fought y'all because I've been to war, and temporarily mistook you for the enemy. The last time I saw Mrs. Driscoll was mid-afternoon as she was bidding me goodbye. That's the God's truth. I would never raise a hand to a woman or harm one in any way if I could help it."
He flashed to how he'd startled Laurel Plummer as she was hanging out her wash, but decided not to mention that encounter. Approaching 2 women who were strangers to him on the same day might compound their suspicions.
"What did you do after leaving the Driscoll's house?"
the sheriff asked. Thatcher told him about renting the room, then seeking out Mr. Barker.
"He hired me."
"As a mechanic?"
"No, he's paying me to train a horse."
The mayor guffawed.
"That horse in the paddock behind Barker's place?"
"If you're referring to a bay stallion, yes," Thatcher said.
"He's a brute, Bill. Others have tried. No one can get near him."
"I can,"
Thatcher said, still speaking directly to the sheriff and trying to ignore the butt-in.
"That'll be easy enough to check with Mr. Barker. By the time I left his place, the sun was going down. I stopped by a second-hand store he'd recommended, but it was closed. I got back to the boarding house a little before 7 o'clock. After supper, I went out on the porch and sat for a spell. A dozen men can vouch for that. Mr. Henry Hobson would vouch for me, too. When I left for the Army, the ranch didn't have telephone service yet. It was out too far. They may have gotten it by now. If not, by hook or crook, you could get word to Mr. Hobson." As an afterthought, he added, "When you do, ask him to please send me my gear. It's locked in a trunk in the bunkhouse. He'll know."
He forced himself to relax his shoulders and sit back in his chair. He'd been as honest and earnest as he knew how to be, but they locked him up anyway. For the next 2 hours, heated discussion filtered through a door that separated the main room from the cell block. Thatcher had been placed in the last cell. He was too far away to catch all the words, but he heard enough to piece together what was happening. The mayor, Bernie Croft was his name, overstepped the duties of his office. Sheriff Amos resented his interference and told him so, although it did no good. Dr. Driscoll cycled between frustration, rage, and despair. The highway department was alerted to be on the lookout for Mila Driscoll. It would be a hostage situation. She couldn't drive. It was suggested that the Texas Rangers be brought into the investigation, but none seemed enthusiastic about the prospect and postponed making a decision. Boats had been launched to search every body of water within a 25-mile radius. Volunteers on horseback and in motor vehicles, many with dogs, had converged on the sheriff's office, creating chaos and a lot of noise, until they were organized into groups and dispatched to search assigned areas. Soon after their departure, the deputy named Scotty brought Thatcher a cup of coffee, a biscuit, and a sausage patty from a nearby cafe. Thatcher thanked him, but the deputy didn't acknowledge it. Thatcher heard his name repeated hundreds of times beyond the door, but hadn't always been able to discern the context in which he was mentioned. He could guess, though. On paper, he looked like a stranger of limited means, who'd wandered into town after having been in a fight, and was seen being friendly with a woman who was now missing. It added up. "It adds up" had become the mayor's refrain, but the sheriff had been reluctant to act on a supposition, especially since they didn't have a witness to a crime or one iota of evidence on which to base a charge against Thatcher Hutton. "We don't even know that a crime has been committed," Thatcher had heard the sheriff exclaim. That had been followed by the doctor's hoarse shout, "Then where is she?" Now, as Thatcher lay on the bunk staring up at the low ceiling, he heard the telephone ring, but it had been ringing often, so he didn't place any importance on this call until Scotty reappeared and instructed him to put his hands, wrists together, through the bars of the cell. After being cuffed, he was guided back into the main room. He knew he must look disheveled, but he had fared the intervening hours better than Dr. Driscoll had. There were dark circles under his eyes, his unknotted necktie lay against his chest, which seemed to have been scooped out like a watermelon. He sat stoop-shouldered, his listless hands dangling between his knees, vacant eyes staring at the floor between his shoes. Thatcher had seen men fresh from a days-long battle looking just like that, like they'd been to hell and back, and were wondering if having survived it was for the better or worse. Hulking Harold was absent. The mayor no longer looked smug, but rather like he'd eaten a bad tamale. Sheriff Amos merely looked tired. He had one hip hitched on a corner of the desk with his nameplate on it. He smoothed his mustache as Thatcher came in. "Mr. Hutton, I just got off the phone with the Potter County Sheriff. I explained our situation here. Telephone operator told him there's no line that goes out to the ranch, so he's sending a man to track down Mr. Hobson. He said it's a far piece out there, so it will take a while before we hear back." Thatcher nodded. "In the meantime, Fred Barker backed up what you told us. So did several men at the boarding house. One had noted that you left the porch and went inside at around 9:30. He remembered because he used the bathroom right after you and saw you go into your room. No one saw or heard you sneaking out after that." Thatcher shifted his feet. "So I can go?" "Well," the sheriff sighed, "seeing as we—" Suddenly, the door flew open and Laurel Plummer burst in, clutching a baby to her chest. Wild-eyed, she scanned the room, drawing up short when she saw Thatcher. "You?" The old man who followed her inside looked Thatcher over, noticed the handcuffs, and harumphed, "Didn't I tell you he was up to no good?" 12. Considering the short amount of time that Thatcher had planned to be in Foley, He had doubted he would ever see Laurel Plummer again. He certainly never would have predicted their next encounter would be under these circumstances. Him in handcuffs, her looking like a woman on the verge of hysteria. The dress she had on was only a little better than the one she'd been wearing yesterday morning. One of her shoelaces had come untied. Her hat looked as though it might have been an afterthought, put on to conceal how untidy and insecure the bun on her nape was. The baby was alternately crying and making strangling sounds. Thatcher guessed the old man who'd followed her in was her father-in-law. Yesterday, all Thatcher had seen of him was his shotgun. He didn't have it with him today, but he was squinting at Thatcher with malevolence. He asked the room at large, "What y'all get him for?" The sheriff blinked with surprise. "You know Mr. Hutton?" "Seen him." "Where?" "He came up to our place yesterday morning. Laurel said, "Never mind that," and rushed across the room to Dr. Driscoll. "Thank God you're here." The plumber's sudden and disruptive entrance had roused the doctor from his stupor. He stood up unsteadily. "Mrs. Plummer, my baby Pearl, remember? You treated her for croup a week and a half ago? I gave her the cough syrup, but it hasn't helped. She's worse. You've got to help her." He seemed at a loss. We went to your house," she went on. "No one answered the door. An old lady who lives across the street saw us and came over. She told us that your wife disappeared last night. I'm sure she got that wrong, but she said that you would probably be here. You've got to examine Pearl." She'd spoken so rapidly and breathlessly, she had to pause and inhale deeply before adding, "Please." The doctor didn't react, only looked at her blankly, as though he hadn't sensed her anxiety or understood a word she'd said. The mayor interceded.
"Mrs. Plummer, was it? I'm Mayor Croft. Dr. Driscoll is indisposed. He's not seeing patients this morning. I could recommend several fine physicians who—"
"I tried that," Irv said, interrupting. "She was bent on finding Doc Driscoll on account of he'd treated Pearl before. There was no saying no to her. The baby's in a bad way."
"She can hardly draw breath." Laurel looked pleadingly at the doctor, but as before, he seemed to be in a trance. With a soft cry of desperation, she turned away from him and took in the scene as though just now grasping the significance of the situation she'd barged in on. "His wife really has disappeared?" She addressed the question to Sheriff Amos.
"Last night. A search is underway, but currently Mrs. Driscoll's whereabouts are unknown."
"The neighbor lady said she'd been abducted."
The mayor loudly cleared his throat. "We're trying to ascertain that from Mr. Hutton."
When Laurel's gaze moved to Thatcher, embarrassment bloomed hotly inside his chest. She focused on the handcuffs, then looked up into his eyes with misgiving. "I thought surely the old lady was senile, talking nonsense."
Thatcher said quietly, "You told me where to look for the advertisement. I went to the address on the card."
"It was Dr. Driscoll's house?"
"I was seen talking to Mrs. Driscoll."
Laurel's father-in-law made a grunting sound, as though this news was confirmation of the low opinion of Thatcher that he'd already formed. The sheriff said,
"Mrs. Plummer?"
She shifted her attention away from Thatcher and back to Bill Amos.
"We met on the occasion of your husband's demise. It was such a difficult time for you, I wasn't sure you would remember."
"Of course I do." He nodded solemnly, then gestured toward Thatcher.
"What can you tell me about Mr. Hutton?"
She scooted the baby up onto her shoulder and tried to shush her. "Nothing, except what Irv already told you. He showed up at our place yesterday."
"What time was that?"
She thought on it. "Around 11, but it could have been 30 minutes either side of that."
"How did he get there?"
"On foot."
"From which direction?"
"I didn't see, but I guess from the south. The railroad is in that direction from us, and he told me he'd jumped off a freight train."
"Did you believe him?"
She hesitated, then said, "It made no difference to me if he was lying or not."
"It did to me," Irv said, "poking around where he don't belong."
The sheriff turned to him.
"He poked around?"
"No, he didn't," Laurel said, giving her father-in-law a look of asperity. "He asked for a drink of water. I gave him one and told him how to get to town, then sent him on his way." The baby began to cough. Laurel patted her on the back. "That's all I know, Sheriff Amos. I've got to get Pearl to a doctor."
A couple more questions. You told Mr. Hutton about the Driscoll's room for rent?
"I didn't know it was theirs. I just remembered seeing the notice in Hancock's window and mentioned it to him when he asked if I knew of somewhere he could stay." She cut a glance at Thatcher, then said to the sheriff, "This really has nothing at all to do with me."
Without a blink, the sheriff continued. Altogether, how long was he there?
"No more than a few minutes, 10 maybe."
Did he look beat up, like he'd been in a fight?
"He had a bump on his head. His hand was wrapped in a handkerchief. The shoulder seam of his coat was ripped."
What was his demeanor, Mrs. Plummer? How did he act toward you?
She took another quick look at Thatcher, and he figured this was where she would tell them about the rooster's attack and what had happened after. But she didn't relate any of that. She said, "He didn't act any particular way. He thanked me for the water and the information and left." She pressed her palm against the baby's forehead. "I must go now and find another doctor."
Doc Perkins is right down the street, Irv said, opening the door. Come on, Laurel.
She walked quickly to the door, then stopped on the threshold and turned back and addressed the doctor. "When I brought Pearl to your office, Mrs. Driscoll treated me kindly. I'm very sorry for what you're going through. I hope you find her soon and that she's safe." Her eyes connected with Thatcher's for a split second, and then she was gone. After they left, the doctor's knees folded and he dropped back into the chair. The mayor said, "Gabe is exhausted. He can't even stand, much less think straight. He should be allowed to go home for a while and rest." No, he said. "I want to stay here, be here in case something... Unable to finish the thought, he rubbed his forehead. "You see," the mayor said, "I'll see him home."
Scotty will see him home, Bill Amos said.
The mayor seemed about to argue, but instead bent down and placed his arm around Driscoll's shoulders. In a murmur usually reserved for priests and undertakers, he began reassuring the doctor that he was going to stay on top of things. The sheriff turned to his deputy and spoke in an undertone, but loudly enough for Thatcher to hear.
"Don't let anybody talk to him. There'll probably be a parade of church ladies bearing food. You take it at the door and thank them on behalf of both the doc and Mrs. Driscoll. If they start asking questions, say you're not at liberty to talk about an ongoing investigation, and that if you do, I'll have your ass chicken fried and served on a platter. And I will, Scotty."
"I understand, sir."
"Anything turns up, I'll come directly there and inform Gabe of it myself. Anything anyone else tells you, regard as rumor or fabrication."
"Yes, sir."
"Get to it."
Scotty crossed the room, and after nudging the mayor aside, took Driscoll gently by the arm, lifted him up, and guided him toward the door. The doctor went along without objection. He looked like a sleepwalker. As Scotty pulled the door closed behind them, Mayor Croft hitched his chin in Thatcher's direction.
"What are we going to do with him?"
"You're not going to do anything with him. He's going back to his cell, and I'm going to make some calls."
"To whom?"
"To whomever I damn well please, Bernie. This is my desk, my office, my department, and my investigation."
Reining in his anger, he said,
"Thank you for your help this morning."
He motioned toward Thatcher.
"Identifying the suspect."
"It was the least I could do. To my knowledge, nothing like this has ever happened in Foley."
"You can't say that yet because we don't know what's happened."
"I want to be apprised as soon as—"
"News has a way of getting to you, Bernie. I'm sure you'll be among the first to hear of any developments."
"I'm depending on you to see that I do."
The sheriff gave a nod that could have been taken either as acquiescence or could have signified nothing at all, and Thatcher figured the latter. With self-importance, the mayor headed for the door, but when he came abreast of Thatcher, he stopped. Meeting him eye to eye, he said in a low and sinister voice, "I don't care who you mistook me for. If you ever put your hands on me again, you won't live to regret it. Do we understand each other?" Thatcher met his threatening stare head-on. "Oh, I think so." Croft held his gaze as he said, "I'll be checking in, Bill." Then he strode to the door and left. The sheriff's relief over seeing him go was obvious, even though that left him alone with Thatcher, who'd been referred to as dangerous and the suspect. He lifted the metal ring that held the keys to the jail cells off a nail on the wall.
"You gonna give me any trouble, Mr. Hutton?"
"No, but I could use the toilet." He'd seen a door at the far end of the corridor marked as such.
"Can't afford you the privacy when I'm the only one here. There's a chamber pot under your bunk."
He signaled for Thatcher to precede him. Once back inside his cell with the door locked, Thatcher stuck his hands between the bars. The sheriff removed the handcuffs. Thatcher said, "I don't know what's happened to Mrs. Driscoll. I had no part in it." The sheriff backed up and propped himself against the wall opposite the cell.
"Why'd you choose that ratty old shack of Irv Plummer's to stop at?"
"It was the first place I'd come to. I needed a drink of water and directions to the nearest town."
"You ever been to Foley before?"
"No, and I wasn't headed here. Like I told you, I was aiming for the Hobson Ranch. But I needed a town to get myself together, earn some money before continuing on."
"You had your poker winnings?"
"They didn't amount to much."
"They did to the men who lost."
"If they couldn't afford to lose, then they shouldn't have been gambling." The sheriff snuffled.
"True enough."
He studied Thatcher as he thoughtfully stroked his mustache.
"Irv seemed to have taken a dislike to you. How come?"
"I have no idea."
"Y'all didn't have a run-in of some kind yesterday?"
"I never even saw him. When I got there, Mrs. Plummer was in the yard hanging out her wash. I didn't know for certain that anyone else was around until he called to her from inside the house. He didn't show himself." Deliberately, he neglected to tell the sheriff about the shotgun, although he couldn't say where his reluctance to mention it came from. "Do you think the baby will be all right?"
"My boy had croup a couple of times when he was little. Sounds worse than it is."
"What's Plummer do for a living?"
"He's a handyman. Drives an old truck."
"It was parked in the yard."
"It's full of tools and gadgets jangling around. You can hear him coming from a mile away. He's quite a character."
"I gathered." Thatcher debated whether or not to leave it there, but decided to be upfront. "I know that Mrs. Plummer's husband died by his own hand just a few months ago. Mrs. Driscoll told me." He recounted how that conversation had come about. "She didn't go into detail, told me only that he shot himself."
"He put a Colt 45 under his chin and pulled the trigger."
Jesus. Thatcher hoped Mrs. Plummer hadn't been the one who found him. That was an awful thing to do to his family. You leave a note?
"No."
The sheriff lowered his head and stared at a spot on the floor between him and the cell.
"When I questioned Mrs. Plummer about it, she told me her husband had come back from the war a different man, that he never recovered from his service over there, and that's what drove him to kill himself."
"It can happen." The sheriff kept his head down but lifted his gaze to Thatcher, looking at him from under a pair of eyebrows that matched his salt and pepper mustache.
"Did it happen to you? See, Mr. Hutton, I recognize the buttons on your coat. My boy wore the same uniform."
He lowered his gaze to the floor again.
"I know the name of the town in France where he's buried. Can't pronounce it, but I can't see it matters much. I doubt I'll ever get there. And anyway, if I were to, there's a bunch of Company B boys all buried together. They couldn't really tell one from the other, they said. Made separate graves. Well, impractical, I guess."
He coughed behind his fist. Thatcher heard him swallow. Then he raised his head and looked Thatcher in the eye.
Were you witness to atrocities like that?
Damn near every day. Even after the armistice, I was left over there to clean up messes that folks who haven't seen can't imagine.
You didn't feel the effects of seeing things like mass graves stuffed with unidentified body parts?
Yes, Mr. Amos, I felt the effects all right, but they didn't make me lose my mind or tempt me to blow my brains out or drive me to abduct women. His hands closed around two of the bars. Seeing all that death only made me determined to get back home and go on living out the rest of my life as best I can.
Their gazes stayed locked for a time. The sheriff was the first to break away. He turned and started down the corridor.
Try to get some shut-eye.
How long can you hold me without charging me?
I don't think you'll have to worry about it.
With all due respect, I do worry about it.
Bill Amos stopped and turned. He subjected Thatcher to a long, assessing stare.
There's a lot about you I'm trying to figure out, but it's occurred to me to wonder why you would spend 10 minutes or more with a young woman who you thought was all alone way out yonder and leave politely without laying a hand on her, then walk 5 more miles on a hot day that topped 80, meet another woman who's 7 months pregnant, and decide to sneak back in the dead of night and carry her off, on foot.
13. Laurel spent an anxious hour pacing the waiting area of the doctor's office, trying to comfort Pearl. Her coughing spasms were relieved only when she could draw enough breath to wail. When they finally were called into the examination room, the elderly physician peered at them through his wire-rimmed eyeglasses and asked,
"What seems to be the problem?"
Laurel wanted to smack him. With a maddening lack of urgency, he went about examining the screaming baby while asking Laurel pertinent questions. In the hope of moving things along, she kept her answers brief and precise. He listened to Pearl's chest, and when he removed the earpieces of the stethoscope, asked if she'd been born early.
"By 3 weeks."
He ruminated on that, then used a medicine dropper to dose Pearl with powdered aspirin dissolved in water.
"This will bring down her fever, and this,"
he said as he similarly administered a dose of sweet-smelling syrup,
"will help with her cough."
He gave Laurel a small bottle of the cough remedy and a packet of the aspirin to take with her. Irv had waited in the car. When he saw her coming from the building, he got up to help her and Pearl into the passenger seat.
"Is it the Spanish flu?"
he asked.
"Pneumonia?"
He didn't say.
He tilted his head and looked at Pearl, who was lying in Laurel's arms.
"She seems better already."
He gave her paregoric.
He frowned.
"That's dope, you know. You'd have been just as well off funneling some whiskey down her throat."
Laurel agreed. Her mother had given her paregoric whenever she'd suffered a stomachache or diarrhea. However, rather than easing her symptoms, the opiate had always nauseated her, making her throw up. She didn't like the idea of the stuff and would be very stingy with the doses she gave Pearl for her cough. Now, however, she was grateful that the baby was no longer struggling for every breath. Pearl's eyes were blinking sleepily, and sleep would be as good a remedy as anything. Laurel kissed her daughter's forehead, then whispered to her,
"Things are going to get better, Pearl. I'm going to make them better. I promise."
After Irv had started the car and gotten behind the wheel, she said,
"I want to see that house for rent."
As they drove through town, Irv reopened the subject of the scene in the sheriff's office.
"That fella Hutton, what do you think?"
"I don't think anything."
"I mean in connection with the doc's wife gone missing."
Rather than answer his question, she asked,
"How was the mayor involved? Is he a close friend of the Driscolls?"
"Nah, he just sticks his big nose into everybody's business."
"Well, this is his business. He's a public official, and a woman in his city went missing overnight."
"You think that Hutton took her?"
"I don't know, Irv."
Her tone reflected how tired she was of his seeming obsession with Mr. Hutton. Since he'd ventured into their yard yesterday, no matter what topic they were talking about, Irv always circled back to him.
Every time she'd asked what had made him so suspicious of the man, his answer was usually the same. "Just don't trust a tall, dark stranger who drops out of nowhere." As now, he muttered, "Don't trust him as far as I can throw him." He would trust Mr. Hutton even less if he knew that he'd placed his hands on Laurel's arms and held her against him. She'd taken his hand. By doing so, she'd given him an opportunity to force himself on her if he'd been of a mind to. No, they had to be wrong to suspect him of molesting Mrs. Driscoll in any way. He'd done nothing in the manner that Sheriff Amos's question had suggested. Nothing to make her fear that he meant her harm or that his intentions were dishonorable. The worst he'd done to her was to make it impossible for her not to think about those moments when they had touched. She feared that seeing him again, even in those circumstances, had prolonged the time it was going to take for her to forget them. The house was as Irv had described, rambling. It appeared to have been broken apart at one point and pieced back together incorrectly. Even more uniquely, it backed up to a sheer wall of limestone. But it was actually better than Laurel had expected. "Can we see inside?" Irv wasn't completely sold on the idea of moving into town, but he turned off the truck's motor, grumbling, "Landlord said he'd leave the key under the porch in a sardine tin." They found the key. The front door's hinges screeched when Irv pushed it open. The interior smelled like mildew with an undertone of dead mouse, but Laurel reasoned that if the front windows were open, the southerly breeze would dispel the odor. Flanking the central hallway were a parlor to the left and a staircase to the right. Laurel stepped into the parlor. The wallpaper was shabby and stained, but it had tall windows and a pretty Victorian carved wood spandrel that demarcated the parlor from the dining room. A door on the far side of it led into the kitchen. "The icebox is the old-fashioned kind," Irv said. "You'd have to have ice delivered, but the stove's electric." Gesturing to the rusty faucets in the sink, he added, "It's tapped into the city water. You won't have to pump no more." "Is there a bathroom?" Irv led her to it. Obviously a late addition, it was tucked under the staircase. The fixtures needed a good scouring, but she was delirious at the thought of no longer having to use an outhouse. "Upstairs?" 2 bedrooms and a sleeping porch. Some of these steps are rotted, so be careful." The front bedroom faced south. Sunlight shone through the dirty windows, from which she could see the tallest buildings of downtown. Having been isolated for months, the thought of having a view of nearby civilization was comforting. She could make this a pleasant room for Pearl and her to share. The sleeping porch was a screened-in, long and narrow space. She would have to think on how best to utilize it. Beyond it was a small, claustrophobic room that had only one east-facing window. The ceiling slanted downward to meet the far wall. "This'll do me fine," Irv said. "I don't require much space." "But you'll have to climb the stairs," Laurel said. "That won't be good for your hip. I have a better idea." She led him back downstairs and into the kitchen. "Build a wall on this end of the kitchen to enclose the keeping room. It has a window. It would easily convert into a bedroom." He scowled. "Where do you get that notion?" "From you. You shouldn't have lied about dividing one room into 2 for a family from Waco." He swore under his breath, but Laurel could tell that the idea appealed to him. The new room would give him access to the rest of the house without having to use the stairs. The back door leading from the kitchen to the outside would also enable him to come and go freely. She pointed that out to him, then stood by, waiting hopefully as he mulled it over for an eternity. "If it's a matter of money..." "It ain't." "I plan to pitch in." "I told you I ain't destitute." "I still have my money." "Keep it. I owe you this." "How so?" "It was my boy who skipped out on you." Whenever the subject of money came up, they argued, and Irv was cranky for days after. She supposed it was a blow to his pride for her to question him about finances. But she suspected his obstinance on the matter went deeper than that. The guilt he felt over leaving Derby in an orphanage weighed even more heavily on him since the suicide. It was too late for him to make restitution to his son. Instead, he had dedicated himself to taking care of Pearl and her. She was strongly opposed to the idea of being accountable or indebted to anyone, even to her well-meaning father-in-law, but she didn't want to scotch renting the house by quarreling with him now. "When can we move in?" He hooked his thumbs under his suspenders and ran them up and down as he took a slow look around. "Well," Laurel said, "I'm taking stock." "You're stalling." "We don't have any furniture." "We don't have any now," she exclaimed, causing Pearl to stir. "Why are you so opposed to this, Irv?" "I ain't." "Good. We'll move in tomorrow." Before he could say anything further, she turned on her heel and left through the front door. By the time he had followed, locked the door, and returned the key to its hiding place, she was in the car, in the driver's seat. He hobbled around to the passenger side and opened the door. "What do you think you're doing?" "Pearl's asleep. You can hold her while I drive." "You need a lot more practice." "I'll have 5 miles worth after driving home. Now get in." 14. Thatcher was confined to the jail cell throughout the day, although after deputies returned, he was allowed 2 visits to the lavatory. Harold grudgingly provided him with a bar of soap and a towel so he was able to wash up. He heard people entering and leaving the building where briefings were held in the main room, but for most of the day, the door at the end of the hall had remained closed, so he was unable to hear everything that was being said. The telephone rang frequently. He supposed updates on the search for Mrs. Driscoll were being called in to Sheriff Amos, but Thatcher didn't sense a thunderbolt from any of the incoming information. Darkness had fallen, and the hubbub in the office had died down before Sheriff Amos came through the door. Thatcher hadn't seen him since their conversation that morning. Apparent to Thatcher immediately was that the stressful day had taken a toll. Bill Amos probably had 25 years on Thatcher, but for a man of his age, he was fit. Tonight, however, he looked like he was under a lot of strain and weary to the bone. Thatcher got up from the bunk and met him at the bars. "Any news?" "We'll get to it." He hefted a lidded enamel pot by its wire handle. "Hungry?" "I could do with something." "Chicken and dumplings." He unlocked the cell and passed Thatcher the pot. "Take it by the handle, it's hot." Thatcher took the pot, lifted the lid, and sniffed. "From the cafe?" "One of Martin's specialities." He took a spoon and napkin from his shirt pocket and passed them through the bars. "Don't dig an escape tunnel with the spoon." He said it with a smile that Thatcher returned. He carried the pot over to the bunk, where he set it down carefully so not to spill. The sheriff didn't withdraw, but stood just beyond the bars, staring at nothing, thoughtfully smoothing his mustache. Thatcher went back over and waited him out until he was ready to reveal the cause of his furrowed brow. He began by saying, "There's news only about where Mrs. Driscoll isn't, nothing about where she is. None of her kin has seen or heard from her. Her uncle and aunt drove up from New Braunfels. They took over for Scotty, staying with Dr. Driscoll." "How's he doing?" "At wit's end. Several times he tried to leave his house and join the search. Wrestled with Scotty and the uncle when they stopped him. Last I heard, they'd persuaded him to take a sleeping draft." "What about me? Are you going to charge me or let me go?" "The district attorney is taking it under advisement." "What's that mean?" "It means that even though we don't have a body or any sign of foul play, Mayor Croft is putting pressure on him." "What kind of man is the district attorney? Hard or soft?" Amos snickered. "Flexible." "The mayor's ready to hang me from the nearest tree. I can't figure why." Amos took a long, pondering look at him. Thatcher sensed they had arrived at the reason for the sheriff's frown. "Mr. Hutton,
How familiar are you with the Anti-Saloon League?
Not familiar at all. Must have been formed while I was overseas. But the name sort of explains itself.
Quite aptly. It's an organization of lobbyists, movers and shakers, zealots,
teetotalers.
They don't merely choose to abstain themselves. Their goal is to rid the earth of every drop of alcohol, along with the people who make it and sell it.
Then they must have got what they were after when Prohibition was made law.
Bill Amos gave a wry grunt. Backed by our fire-breathing governor, the League succeeded before that. Last year, Texas passed laws that are stricter than the federal ones. They've made even minor infractions felonies, which carry much stiffer punishments.
Did that curb consumption?
Sheriff Amos gave a soft laugh. Just the opposite. Since these laws went into effect, moonshining and bootlegging have become booming businesses. Men wanting a drink would find one. Thatcher thought back on the two men at the boarding house who'd left together in search of booze. Hell, he remembered soldiers in the trenches fermenting whatever they could, making undrinkable concoctions, which they drank anyway. The sheriff continued. Some members of the Anti-Saloon League, the governor included, are of the opinion that we local law enforcement agencies and personnel are soft on transgressors, that a large number of us are corrupt, and that we're doing a lousy job of helping them accomplish their goal of making Texas 100% dry. So they've devised a way to assist us in identifying, capturing, and prosecuting offenders.
How's that?
By recruiting what the governor has termed innocent bystanders.
Thatcher said, "What the hell?"
In order to convict a bootlegger, state law requires a third-party eyewitness to testify to the illegal sale. Since an innocent bystander of such a transaction is rarer than hen's teeth, the League is
recruiting them.
The sheriff nodded. Men to work undercover. They infiltrate areas where moonshiners are thriving. They make friends with the culprits, pretend to be one of them, gain their trust, then rat on them, in court and under oath. The sheriff took a deep breath and met Thatcher's gaze. I think the reason our mayor took an immediate dislike to you is because he suspects you might be one of these official snitches. He raised his eyebrows. I suspect it too. Thatcher gave a short laugh.
Me? I didn't even know there was such a thing. Only undercover agents I've ever heard of were Pinkerton men.
The sheriff stared at him, unfazed by his denial.
Nobody sent me here, Thatcher said. When I jumped off that train, I didn't even know where I was. It was dumb fate that I even wound up in this town.
You're telling me the truth?
Damn straight.
Texas Rangers didn't send you here to make sure I'm square and enforcing the law?
No.
I wouldn't hold it against you.
Swear to you, Sheriff, and I'll tell you something else.
He held up his hand, palm out so the cut was visible.
I'll defend myself against a guy wanting to knife me, but I wouldn't tattle on somebody that I'd befriended. That would go against my grain.
Amos assimilated that, then said, All right then. I'll take your word for it, and if Bernie ever voices his suspicion again, I'll tell him I already confronted you about it, and you flat out denied it.
If the mayor suspects I've been sent to rout out local moonshiners, wouldn't he favor that? Why is he hostile?
Because he ramrods the most prosperous bootlegging operation in the region.
Thatcher took that news like a clip on the chin. Son of a bitch, he said under his breath. Why don't you arrest him?
The sheriff grimaced. That'd be messy.
Thatcher didn't press him to elaborate. He felt it possible that arresting the mayor would create a conflict of interest for the sheriff. The ethics of these men were no concern of his. Even if the sheriff dealt dirty on some matters, Thatcher felt that he was a basically good and conscientious man. Well, the mayor won't have to worry about me for long, Thatcher said. I'll be heading up to the Panhandle soon, assuming you let me go.
I thought you'd have heard something from Mr. Hobson by now."
"Sheriff called me back. They had a hell of a sandstorm up there. The deputy dispatched to go out to the ranch got lost."
"I've experienced storms like that," Thatcher said. "You can't see a foot in front of you."
"Well, the fella turned around and managed to make his way back to Amarillo without crashing into something. He'll try again tomorrow."
That was disappointing. Henry Hobson Jr. had been more than simply the man he'd cowboyed for. He'd been his mentor. Mr. Hobson was a man of his word. A character reference from him would go a long way toward clearing Thatcher of suspicion. The sheriff was absently plucking at the corner of his mustache. Thatcher had come to recognize the signs. The sheriff wasn't done with him yet. Eventually he said,
"There's something niggling me."
Thatcher thought it best not to ask what.
"When we brought you in here and started questioning you, why didn't you tell us you'd stopped at the plumber's place?"
Thatcher's guard went up. "Didn't seem worth mentioning."
"Bullshit. It was damn worth mentioning because Laurel Plummer could have attested that you had the bruise, the cut, before you ever made it into town and met Mila Driscoll. You relied on Fred Barker to back you up, people in the boarding house, but you deliberately omitted mention of her. Why?"
Thatcher shifted his stance, knowing that it probably gave away his uneasiness. "I'd approached 2 women that day. They were strangers to me and, best to my knowledge, alone. I thought if y'all knew about Mrs. Plummer, in addition to Mrs. Driscoll, it would look bad."
"It does. It looks bad that you didn't volunteer the information, and I don't think you're being completely honest with me now, are you? What happened out yonder at her place?"
"Not a thing. It was just like she said." She'd left out what had happened out by the water pail. Obviously, she was embarrassed by that and didn't want anybody knowing about it, so Thatcher wasn't going to give it away. But he could tell the sheriff the truth about the rest of it. "In the short time I was there, it was plain to me that Mrs. Plummer had reached the end of her rope. I got the sense that she'd had more than her fair share of hard knocks lately, and I didn't want to heap on another problem for her."
"You felt compassion for her?"
"I guess you could put it like that." Amos took his measure, then exhaled heavily.
"If you're indicted, I advise you against putting it like that. The mayor, the DA, would pounce on it."
"I don't follow."
"You felt sorry for Mrs. Plummer, so you got your drink of water, your directions into town, and left her alone. Then you met Mila Driscoll. It could be surmised that you felt no compassion for her."
He let the implication sink in, then nodded toward the bunk.
"Don't let your supper get cold."
15. Wallace Johnson had been born with a pair of jug ears like none other. Not only did they exemplify the term, they sat low on his head and were pointy on top. This manifestation of a problematic gene pool had made him a target for torment by his passel of siblings, by his mother when she got on one of her infamous tears, and by his classmates during all 6 years of his schooling. He dropped out at the age of 12 and went into the family business, for which limited literacy wasn't a drawback. By the time Wally had reached his late teens, the ridicule he'd suffered in his youth hadn't made him timid and faint-hearted, as one might expect. Instead, he was arrogant, aggressive, and meaner than hell. Somewhere along the way, he had learned to wiggle his ears, making them even more notable. Nowadays, when teased, he used this talent to distract from his reaching for brass knuckles, which he then vigorously applied to the individual who'd insulted him. One of Gert's whores, who was relatively new to lefties and didn't hail from the area, was unaware of Wally Johnson's reputation for a short temper and violent bent. She was fully aware of it now. Which was why Gert had left her husband to tend to a middling crowd and had taken back roads out into the countryside to where 2 clear-running, spring-fed creeks converged, making it an ideal spot for one of the Johnson family's distilleries. Wally was the family member assigned to operate and protect this particular still.
Sometimes a kid cousin helped out with heavy lifting or needed repairs, but Wally preferred to work alone. He lived in a lean-to tucked beneath a shelf of limestone, which helped shelter him from the elements. The geological configuration also hid the fire required to keep the sour mash cooking at a low boil, thus making the still unlikely to be detected. Wally's great-granddaddy, Hiram, had chosen the location for just that reason. The still had been producing corn liquor uninterrupted for decades. When she was still a distance away, Gert rolled her Model T to a halt and blinked her headlights twice, slowly, then 3 times in rapid succession, signaling that she was a customer and not a hostile competitor or the law. Wally emerged from his lean-to, cradling a rifle in the crook of his elbow, but having recognized Gert's vehicle, motioned her forward. She drove up to within yards of where he stood, stopped, and climbed out. She motioned toward the still. "Why ain't you cooking tonight?"
"Didn't have a mind to," Wally replied. "You bring my money?"
She planted her hands on her broad hips.
"Damn it, Wally, I'm as pissed off at you as I can be at a person, and that's saying something."
"What for?"
"What for? I'll tell you what for. Thanks to you, I got a whore who's out of commission."
"You told me to do something that'd guarantee getting Doc Driscoll out to the roadhouse, and that's what I did. Saw him arrive myself."
"I told you to rough up the girl a little. You broke her arm, her jaw's out of whack, and her eyes all swole up and ain't sitting right."
"She told me she'd as soon fuck a bat as me, which I reminded her of, she said."
Gert gave a snort.
"You've heard worse."
He held out his hand, palm up.
$20, Gert."
"I ought to subtract what her ruined appearance will cost me in lost revenue."
She looked over at his stockpile of moonshine.
"But because I'm a forgiving person, I'll take a jar for the road and we'll call it even."
He cursed her under his breath, but went over to a straw-lined crate, lifted out a mason jar of white lightning, and brought it back to her. She screwed off the lid and took a swallow.
"You're one ugly son of a bitch, Wally, but you do make good shine."
$20.
He held out his hand again. Gert screwed the lid back onto the mason jar and tucked it in her left armpit, then reached into the pocket of her dress, took out a pistol, and shot Wally in the forehead. She bent over his supine form, stuck the bore of the pistol into one of his ears, and fired again. As she was getting back into her car, she muttered,
"Pissant cost me a week's worth of work out of that girl."
16. Shortly after noon the next day, Harold came to Thatcher's cell. His looks hadn't improved since Thatcher had last seen him. He might have explained that he'd mistaken him for a German soldier and apologized for messing up his face, but the deputy radiated so much hostility as he said,
"They want to see you,"
that Thatcher didn't bother. After being handcuffed, he was prodded out of the cell block and into the main room. Mayor Croft was standing in front of a window, a position that cast him in silhouette, obscured his face, and made him the most imposing presence in the room, which Thatcher figured was his intention. If he thought Thatcher would be intimidated by either his public office or his bootlegging, he was wrong. Thatcher looked him square in the eye. Sheriff Amos motioned Thatcher into a chair.
"Coffee?"
Thatcher accepted. The sheriff filled a mug from a pot simmering on a hot plate, then brought it over. When he bent down to place the mug in Thatcher's bound hands, he said under his breath, "Don't volunteer anything." Then he straightened up, sat down on the corner of his desk, and commenced another interrogation. Beginning with the fight and Thatcher's leap from the freight train, they rehashed Thatcher's account of that day. The sheriff's questions were straightforward. Following his advice, Thatcher stuck to the facts and didn't expand on any of his statements. Bernie Croft didn't pose any questions, but expressed his skepticism of Thatcher's truthfulness with snorts and harumphs and dry coughs covered by his fist. Thatcher finished with, "I went to bed, fell asleep, woke up with a shotgun in my face and y'all surrounding my bed." The sheriff waited a beat, then looked over at Croft, who had remained in his spot by the window, but was now rocking back and forth on his heels, like a man trying to keep his temper under control. Bill said, "We don't have one iota of evidence implicating him, Bernie."
"Except that he was with Mrs. Driscoll earlier that day."
The sheriff dismissed that with a shake of his head.
"Circumstantial. The DA has declined to indict him based on that alone."
"Something could still turn up."
"Mrs. Driscoll could still turn up."
"Dead?"
"Let's pray that's not the case. But if, after further investigation, we discover something that does implicate Mr. Hutton in any wrongdoing, I'll be on him like a duck on a June bug."
The mayor scoffed.
"He'll be long gone. He doesn't plan to leave town immediately."
"So he says."
Thatcher said, "Mr. Barker and I shook on me training that stallion before I leave."
"That's hardly a binding contract."
"It is to me." Thatcher's words fell like 4 bricks into the room. Croft's face turned red, but he didn't respond. No one said anything. Then Sheriff Amos broke the taut silence.
"I've got to release him, Bernie, but I'll do so with the provision that he doesn't leave town. If not a suspect, he's still a material witness."
"Fine, but you're gambling with your re-election."
"Every damn day I'm in this office."
Because his warning didn't have the desired cowing effect on the sheriff, Croft strode across to the door, yanked his hat off the coat tree, and stormed out, pulling the door closed so hard it rattled window panes. Amos signaled to Harold.
"Uncuff him."
With obvious disgust, the deputy lumbered over and removed the handcuffs. Sheriff Amos said,
"Mr. Hutton, you heard the condition of me letting you go. Don't run off."
"What if Mrs. Driscoll never turns up? I can't stick around here forever. I want to get home." "No word from Amarilla?"
"Not yet, but it's early. It'll be a round trip for whoever drives out to the ranch, and you said it was a far piece from the city."
Thatcher acknowledged that, then said, "As much as anybody, I want to know what happened to Mrs. Driscoll, not just for my sake. I hate to think."
"Me too," the sheriff said. "I've moved past hoping she'll turn up unharmed and with a logical explanation for her absence."
Giving Thatcher a keen look, he said,
"I'm letting you go. Don't betray my trust."
Then he glanced over his shoulder at Harold.
"You have his bag ready?"
The deputy carried over Thatcher's duffel and dropped it at his feet.
"Everything's there, including the nudie pictures."
Thatcher gave him a sardonic grin. "Good. They're souvenirs I'm taking to the other hands at the ranch." He shouldered the strap of the bag and walked out. Bill went home for lunch. He was halfway into his meal when the telephone rang. He left the table, went into the hall, and answered. A deputy identified himself. "Wally Johnson's been found dead. 2 bullet wounds through his head." That was more than enough to spoil Bill's appetite. He pulled his napkin from his shirt collar and blotted his mouth.
"Who found him?"
"A cousin."
"Where?"
The deputy described the scene. "The still was intact. There was a stockpile of product. Barrels of mash were fermenting. Only thing spoiled was Wally."
"What's the cousin's name, besides Johnson?"
"Elray."
"He owned up to moonshining?"
"Kid's only 14. He was scared shitless that whoever did in Wally was going to come after him too. Said he'd rather be in jail as in Wally's shoes."
"How do I get there?"
The deputy gave him directions. "I'll wait for you at the turnoff, otherwise you might miss it."
"Has the JP been notified?"
"He's on his way. Not that we need an official pronouncement. Wally's deader than a doornail. Shot through one of his ears." Sighing over the ill-concealed mirth in the deputy's voice, Bill hung up. But no sooner had he turned away from the telephone than it rang a second time. He picked it up again.
"This is Sheriff Amos."
Gabe Driscoll sat at the dining table, force-feeding himself from the plate of food Mila's aunt had insisted he eat. He had met these relatives of Mila's only once before, and that had been on his wedding day. Whenever Mila had gotten homesick for her extended Teutonic family, with whom he had nothing in common, not even language, he would put her on a train and cite a heavy patient load as his excuse for not accompanying her. Yesterday, these family ambassadors hadn't so much arrived as descended. They had been beside themselves with worry over Mila's fate. But it had come as an unwelcome surprise that they were equally worried about him and his fragile condition. They'd smothered him with platitudes, advice, sympathy, and affection, which he didn't want and certainly hadn't earned. His only means of escape had been to lock himself in his bedroom with a sleeping draught, which had been a bootlegged bottle of bourbon. This morning, when he'd come downstairs, looking even more haggard than he had yesterday, the older couple seemed intent on convincing him that whatever had become of Mila, her leaving hadn't been voluntary. He'd said, "I'll admit that I wondered if she'd had a man in her life before she met me. Maybe she had heard from him and—" They chorused a swift denial. She hadn't had a serious beau before him. She wouldn't have forsaken him or broken her marriage vows, not their Mila. She loved Gabe dearly and wanted desperately to be a mother. He'd coughed a sob and held his head between his hands. "Of course I know that. I do. I'm certain she didn't leave of her own accord." Now, having eaten enough to pacify the aunt, he thanked her for preparing lunch, excused himself from the dining room, and barricaded himself in his office, where he poured himself a bourbon. He carried the drink over to the sofa, took off his shoes, and reclined, covering his scratchy, burning eyes with his forearm. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. His cuffs were loose, his collar button undone, his trousers wrinkled from having been wallowed in. If he caught a glimpse of himself in a reflective surface, he barely recognized the image. He looked like a bum, bearing scant resemblance to the self-possessed physician who people relied on for healing and succor. He very much doubted that he would ever regain the high regard and status that he'd had before his wife had gone missing. Even if Mila had abandoned him of her own volition, her mysterious disappearance would leave a stain on him as permanent as a port wine birthmark. That distressing thought was interrupted when he heard an automobile approaching. Sheriff Amos? That Deputy Scotty again? Had they found her? Heart-thumping, he drained his bourbon, rolled up off the sofa, and padded over to the bay window. Peeking around the edge of the drapery, he watched a shiny black touring car come to a stop in front of his house. Around town, it was a familiar automobile. As was the driver, whose name was Jimmy Hennessy. He got out and assisted Bernie Croft from the back seat. The mayor strutted up Gabe's walkway, chest thrust out, like a despot about to watch a parade of his military might. Hennessy stayed with the car, a daunting, pugnacious presence against the backdrop of Miss Wise's Victorian house and bright petunia beds. The doorbell jingled. Mila's uncle went to answer. Gabe heard him quietly explaining that the doctor was unavailable to visitors and wouldn't be seeing patients until further notice. Bernie, of course, was having none of it. He declared that the doctor would see him. Over the uncle's objections, Bernie came inside. Gabe followed the sound of his footsteps, which stopped outside his office door. There was hard knocking. "Gabe, it's Bernie." Gabe's head dropped forward, and he maintained that helpless pose until the door was rapped on again, this time more imperiously. "Open up." Gabe trudged to the door, flipped the lock, and pulled it open. Looking beyond Bernie, Gabe addressed the apologetic uncle. "It's all right. Mayor Croft is a friend." The uncle retreated. Bernie forged in. Gabe closed the door. Bernie went straight over to the ledge of the bookshelf where he helped himself to the bottle of bourbon, splashing some into a tumbler. When Bernie turned and extended the bottle toward Gabe, he shook his head. Noticing the empty glass on the end table beside the sofa, Bernie said, "Just as well, I think. Appears you've already been imbibing." Gabe didn't reply. but returned to the sofa and slumped against the back cushions. Mila had spent months painstakingly doing the cruel work on them. The mayor made himself comfortable in an armchair.
"You should open a window, Gabe. You stink. The whole room reeks of you."
He could smell his sour odor himself. Since having to report Mila missing, he hadn't washed, hadn't shaved. With indifference, he'd observed himself becoming more and more disheveled, but had done nothing to stop the deterioration. "That's what you came to tell me? That I stink?" Bernie took a sip of whiskey.
"The DA has declined to indict Hutton. He's been released from custody."
That was hardly surprising, as no evidence had been found to implicate him. But that he'd been eliminated as a suspect wasn't welcome news, which Gabe supposed was the reason Bernie had come to break it to him personally. "No other persons of interest?"
"None. Of course they're continuing the search, but sooner or later the zeal will begin to flag and eventually they'll stop looking. I'm sure you realize that."
Gabe nodded morosely. The mayor crossed one leg over the other and propped his glass of whiskey on his knee. Alerted by the feigned casualness, Gabe sat up straighter. "What?"
"Do you recognize the name Wally Johnson?"
"Of the infamous Johnsons?"
"More infamous than most. It was Wally who beat up that whore at Lefty's, the one you were summoned to treat."
"So?"
"His body was found this morning. He'd been assassinated. My sources in the sheriff's department tell me it was ghastly. Carrion birds and such."
Gabe just looked at him with dispassion. After an ahem, Bernie said,
"The reason I bring it up, this homicide will divert attention from your wife's disappearance. Now that Bill Amos has a murder to solve, and seeing as how it involves a pack of jackals like the Johnsons, he'll be focused on that. The missing persons case will fade into thin air."
Gabe plopped back onto the cushions. "What happens then?"
"You resume your practice, and you begin working for me."
Gabe dug his middle finger and thumb into his eye sockets. He mumbled, "I don't think I can." Around a soft laugh, Bernie said,
"You can. You will. Consider this a swift kick in the ass."
Gabe lowered his hand from his eyes. "It's too soon. I'm not over the shock of Mila yet."
"Get over it. Patience isn't my strong suit."
"Look at me, Bernie. I can barely function, much less take on additional responsibilities." Bernie tossed back the rest of his whiskey and, with a decisive thump, set the glass beside Gabe's empty one on the end table.
"This whining won't do, Gabe."
With desperation, he said, "I can't just snap my fingers and have things return to any kind of normalcy. It's going to take time."
"Of course you're right."
Smiling, the mayor got up and walked over to